Our guest speaker today is Autumn Hogsma. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Okay. Director of the Michigan Geological Repository for Research and Education. And she's also the Assistant Director of the Michigan Geological Survey, which is part of Western Michigan University. She has led carbon capture, utilization, and storage research for more than a decade, including understanding the technical, environmental, and societal challenges of it. So today she's going to give us a short discussion on carbon capture.
So I always joke around that when I introduce my title, I get a little breathless because it's a whole lot of words to put in at once. So if you hear me say MAGRI and MGS, those are the acronyms for the repository and for our survey. So I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. So I'm a Michigan native. I grew up in Otsego, which is just north of Kalamazoo, between Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids. I went to Central Michigan University for my undergraduate in physics and geology. From there, I went on to the University of Minnesota for a master's in geophysics. Took a break between my master's and my PhD. I worked at a company called Battelle in Columbus, Ohio, which is the world's largest nonprofit that does research and technology development. And there they had a whole group that was dedicated to researching carbon sequestration and other climate-focused technologies. So I worked for them for about a decade, and towards the end of my time there, I went to Miami University in Ohio and finished my PhD in geology. So I came back to Michigan. It felt great coming home, being close to family and just being back in Michigan has been great. But I joined the MAGRI and MGS in January of 2023. Before I joined them, they were in this really hard position where the Geological Survey didn't have any funding for the last 30 years or so. So it was really just a one-man show for quite a while. So they were just kind of getting by on little grants here and there, the little bits of research. But our director at the time was this real champion and secured some annual state funding now for the survey, which has allowed me to be hired, but also a whole team to be hired. So we've experienced exponential growth over the past year and a half. And our research is going with that, which is really exciting. So when I joined MGS, I had a few goals in joining, was that I wanted to expand our clean energy offerings with particularly a focus on carbon sequestration and any other type of climate-related research. But I also think it's really important to integrate what we're doing with how it might impact societies and communities. So that overlap is going to be, I think, critical for any type of project success. And then I have a passion for working with students and helping to train that next generation of geoscientists. So I'll be mentoring a slew of students, and we have a lot of outreach and education avenues that we do too, and I'll talk more about that. But on a personal note, being a geologist, I think it's natural is that I really love rocks and I love collecting rocks. So when we moved, it was lots of complaints from our helpers on the boxes of literal rocks that were being moved into our home. And I love to hike, and I like to read and write, and I love art. And I have 3 kids, 2 dogs, 5 cats, and a partner, and we are a very overflowing household, but I certainly love the chaos of it. So when I talk about MGS and MAGRI, as I mentioned, we kind of had this interesting history, and we've really been growing, and we're doing a lot of really great work, I think. So we host the only geological repository in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, which is quite literally a warehouse full of rocks and samples, records, data. And then we have a sister repository in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that hosts similar types of rocks and data and information. So with this, one of our missions is to, preserve, curate this kind of like a museum, but also make this data accessible for a variety of research and for education, for educational materials. So within our repository here, we have probably more than 30 different types of data and collections, hundreds of thousands of feet of rock. These numbers on here are a bit outdated now, but we've had, numerous projects, lots of graduate students and several undergraduate students working with us. Previously, we would aim to reach somewhere around 5,000 students a year in that K through 12 range with some of our outreach. I'm really excited that this year we've surpassed 15,000 students that we've engaged with. We've been involved in some pretty big events this year, which has been exciting to share the different type of work that we're doing here in Michigan. So I mentioned that my research focus is in that carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or carbon sequestration realm, which is really driven by, climate change. And this is a quote that I really like by the IEA, is that we need a radical transformation in how we produce and how we consume energy. And there's a lot of other things that go in that too. But we really do need to make a change and make a change yesterday to mitigate some of the negative impacts of climate change and global warming. And, we see these all around the world right now, such as, extreme temperatures and drought and weather patterns and melting ice and rising sea levels. So there's a lot of science, a lot of evidence out there right now to show just how much of change there is happening. But that's not the only reason. When we think about looking towards the future, we have a continued increase in our population. And when we have increased population, we also need more energy. We're going to need more things produced, different types of materials produced. We're going to create more waste. And all of these processes create more CO2 emissions, more greenhouse gas emissions. The IEA and some other groups out there too have done regular annual kind of models where they're looking at kind of what combinations of technologies are needed to meet our global reduction goals, and how can we get there. And in all those models, they have shown that CCUS is one of the critical technologies to help us meet those goals. I do want to say it is not the only technology. It has to happen in tandem with a lot of other things, such as renewable energy, growth in things like hydrogen, and production of critical minerals to support the growth of clean energy. So there's a lot of things that need to happen at once for us to move towards those goals. But CCUS is really my focus. And as I mentioned, that stands for the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So this is the process of capturing CO2 from a man-made source. So things like power plants, could be cement plants, steel manufacturing, anything that's creating and emitting greenhouse gases. Utilization has a variety of meanings. A lot of folks think of this mostly for enhanced oil recovery, but there are other ways that CO2 is being utilized and the creation of like sustainable materials. And then for this, there are really three components to think about. Is that you have a capture side of things where that's where your CO2 is being emitted. You have a certain type of technology based on the source, and that is being captured and processed. And then for transportation, because a lot of the times, as I'll show you, that where you can store CO2 isn't necessarily where you're creating the CO2. So you have to get it from point A to point B. And then the storage component. And there are a few different types of storage, and Michigan has all of them, which is what makes it an exciting place to think about CCUS. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those too. So, my focus as a geologist is on the deep subsurface, on where can we store this CO2. And at a high level, there are a few requirements that we absolutely have to make sure are in place. We want these to be deep, and deep enough in quotes, as in CO2, when you put it under pressure and temperature, certain pressure and temperature conditions, it will compress and behave more like a liquid and less like a gas, which makes it more manageable, a little more predictable in its behavior. And then it's a lot more efficient on how much you can store in a space. You want to be targeting storage zones that are not potential sources for drinking water. And then that it is far enough away from any type of potential sources for drinking water so that we protect our water resources. So we need a type of rock that we can store it in. So it has to have that ability. And then similarly, a type of rock that's going to make sure that CO2 stays in the ground and it's not going to move. It's not going to migrate upward. And then the other type of formation or storage option is in depleted oil and gas fields. So Michigan has several depleted oil and gas fields. We still have some active ones. And these are a great option for storage as they kind of have a long history of already holding fluids in place. And we have that potential of maybe utilizing some of that existing infrastructure with a little bit less need for building new. And then a lot of folks are looking at this as well as a potential for enhanced oil recovery. So folks are already doing this in Michigan and other places in the world where they inject the CO2. It helps mobilize stranded oil. They cycle it back out and re-inject that CO2. And in that process, CO2 gets stored, and then whatever gets produced back out gets recycled again. And that helps with some of the project economics because the capture technology can be pretty expensive. There have been some studies in Michigan a few years ago now that were looking at a particular geologic formation that they estimated that there could be at least 50 million tons of CO2 stored with more than 100 million barrels of oil that could be recovered if using that for enhanced oil recovery and not just for storage. The third type of storage in Michigan is in our basalts, these rocks that we have in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. For our igneous rocks, they're from volcanic activity in the past. And if you look at the kind of headlines for this, and if you Google this at all, the common phrase is that you're turning CO2 into rocks. So this is an exciting potential avenue because the way that CO2 will react with the rocks turns it into some like a cement. It mineralizes it. So then it is no longer a gas or a liquid. It turns into a solid. And so we're just starting to think about the possibility of this in Michigan, where we have some projects partnering with Michigan Tech University to look at this a little bit more closely. So where in Michigan, I get this question a lot. So where in Michigan can we do CCUS? And I know this is a really busy map and I want to point a handful of things out here. Is that first that we've had a history of projects that have evaluated different regions in Michigan. And some of these are covered with these boxes. Like this big red box up here was a past federal funded project to look at some specific formations. These stars, this little red star and this big yellow star, those were actual injection tests. So that little red star, they injected about 60,000 tons of CO2 and tested out that feasibility. And then that big yellow star is where they injected a couple of million tons of CO2 into a specific formation. So they're tested out a handful of different technologies to see how do we monitor this? Is it safe? Are there any potential leakage pathways? Can we detect that? So those were some really impactful projects in Michigan to show that this is possible, that this can be done. And then we have a lot of things coming up. That's what all of these other rectangles on this map are some future projects that are either starting or will be starting or are in the works. With partnerships between industry and academia and researchers to start to either evaluate sites or develop a site for CO2 storage. And then there's these dashed lines on this map that kind of highlight some potential areas to think about. Like when I talked about that basalt mineralization, that's going to happen in the western part of the Upper Peninsula. So that will be an area where we focus. So in general, Michigan said it has these different types of storage, which is really exciting. We have a diversity of sources. We have over 200 different facilities in Michigan that report CO2 emissions, and that adds up to about 75 million tons of CO2 a year. And these past projects have shown we have more than 70 billion tons of storage possible, and those are just in some limited studies. So we can more than match what we are making for an extended period of time. What this process looks like, so we start with kind of a big level. So thinking, maybe like the state of Michigan. So we start by looking at where in the state meet these criteria I talked about. Is it deep enough? Is it non-drinkable water? Is it far enough from our water source? Is it suitable for storage? But there's also a lot of other questions that need to be answered in there outside of the geologic side of things. For example, things like societal considerations, like land use. Are there protected habitats? Is there a history of environmental injustice that we need to be aware of? How are we going to get it from the source to where we're going to store it? And if that requires transportation, the same type of questions need to be answered for any transportation route so that we make sure that the whole process, the whole value chain is safe. And then we zoom in from there. So we start with Michigan, you start finding these sub-regions of where is it possible, and then we get into these sub-regions and start doing more detailed geologic work to really understand the nitty-gritty details. And then we go in further and go in further until we're very confident and we've done our due diligence over an area before a project can start. So what are the risks with this? There are some risks that we should be aware of and be thinking about, especially in the early stages, all through planning, execution, and operation of this, is that leakage is a real risk. When you're talking about injecting, a large volume of CO2 into the subsurface, you want to make sure that it's going to stay there and that it's not going to leak back up. So some potential leakage pathways are some like existing faults or structural features in Michigan. So if you don't know that there's a fault nearby and you inject CO2, there's potential that could travel and transport back up that fault into other regions. Similarly, if you have some old faults nearby, the pressure from injecting CO2 could reactivate some of these features and cause induced seismicity. And then there's other things like existing wellbores. So Michigan has more than 90,000 wellbores across the state. And you can think of those as, 90,000 potential straws into the subsurface. So you need to know a whole lot about the history of those wells and make sure that they are secure and not potential pathways. And if there are potential pathways, develop some mitigation strategies and plans to ensure that this doesn't leak out. And then there's also things like, economic risks as well, because some of this technology can be very expensive, and how you plan for that and how that might change over time is also a question. And the other thing to think about is kind of the societal and environmental impacts as well. So when you think about what are some potential negatives for CCUS site, is that if you had to leak, what is that environmental impact like? And how do you plan for that? How do you mitigate it? And how do you communicate that risk with communities? Would there be an increased industrial footprint? Could there be more traffic or more noise or potential eyesores from the development of this infrastructure? And what we also don't want to see is an increase in energy costs, right? We don't want to have any additional burdens to our energy costs for communities. But there are a lot of positives. We need to think about how this is going to improve our air quality, how we're going to decrease our emissions. It's going to help us move forward with our goals for both climate and our energy dependency. I think there's a real opportunity for the transition of job skills, such as from moving from the oil and gas industry into clean energy and improving our access to clean energy. So I mentioned a little bit when looking at that map is that we have a lot of history on doing some research in Michigan. We've actually been involved in this research for more than 35 years in a variety of different applications. There's a couple of big projects to mention. Is one of them is the Midwest Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership, or MRCSP. This one ended a couple of years ago, but this is the one that did those big injection tests. And all their reports and their data is all publicly available, and it's a really wonderful resource. That project actually led to another project called MRCI, which is similarly all publicly available data information has come out of that. And we've had a variety of other projects as well, that we have a lot of great resources that go with it. This really helped develop the foundation to support the growth that I've been bringing in since I joined McGree. So we have a lot of projects that are starting and some that are in planning stages that I want to mention. I'm going to tell you mostly about this first project, which is called the Advancing CCUS in Michigan. This particular project, I'm focused on de-risking CCUS by looking at some of those things that I had told you about, making sure we understand how what the rocks are like and how CO2 is going to stay in place, and evaluating the well bores to make sure that there aren't other leakage pathways, and how we integrate this with societal considerations and doing community engagement and outreach. And then we have Project Clean Michigan coming up soon. This is a collaboration with Western Michigan University, and they're using with the engineering department, and they're using direct air capture technology, and they're developing that further, which is really exciting. And then we're on a couple of projects that are called Carbon Safe, which is a Department of Energy funded initiative that are supporting the commercial development of carbon sequestration. So there's actually a couple of places in Michigan that have been awarded these projects. So they will be doing some testing soon. And then a new project we also just found out we won is called RITAP, which is a regional initiative for technical assistance partnership. And this is really a large collaboration where we're going to integrate all these different pieces and develop a roadmap and strategy on how to safely deploy CCUS in Michigan. And various other ones too, where we're focused not just on CCUS, but on making sure that all of our data is preserved and accessible and digitized and made available in various formats. Working on developing educational materials and curriculum and resources for K through 12, for community colleges, for minority serving institutions and various universities as well. So my project right now, I'll tell you a little bit more about is, as I said, the Advancing CCUS in Michigan, where this project started in January of this year, and it's a 2-year project. And I'm really focused on that reducing risks and closing some of those critical gaps in knowledge. And also building strong relationships with stakeholders and communities. So we're doing this in a variety of ways, looking at validating our storage, making sure that we understand our pressure management solutions, looking at the rocks that are going to make sure our CO2 is going to stay in the ground, and looking at our well bores. And with this, as well as building up our engagement and education with various stakeholders and communities. My goal at the end of this project is to create some publicly available tools with some guidance materials, so that a variety of people, whether they're academia, students, researchers, general public, that they have a tool that they can go to and be informed and have the data and the resources to be empowered to make their own decisions about CCUS in their communities. So this project is, we're the lead on this project, but we're partnering with Central Michigan University and my friend and colleague, Sally Greenberg. And Sally is a long-term expert in community engagement and kind of a champion for how to make CCUS safe and successful nationally and internationally. She's an incredible woman. So we have these multiple tasks I had talked about, and then we're working closely with that MRCI project team and then with Eagle as well. Right now I have 6 students working with me, and a couple more students will be starting in the spring semester, and they're doing a variety of different activities, and it's a great way for them to get engaged, but also to learn about CCUS and develop some really, I think, great skills for their future careers. So one of our tasks, as I mentioned, is really focused on this community engagement, stakeholder engagement. Otherwise named as the societal considerations and impacts. So this is looking at a integration of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, meeting the Justice 40 initiative and how the benefits of these projects feed directly into that Justice 40 initiative, how we can develop community engagement strategies, and how we implement these types of strategies. So right now, these are all linked throughout the technical tasks. And then we're also looking at how do we utilize our existing outreach mechanisms and our social media platforms. So speaking of our outreach, this is one place I'm really proud of our group that does. As I mentioned, we reach thousands of K through 12 students a year, but also thousands of general public. We have regular workshops with various industries, with researchers, academia. We host professors from various universities and colleges, even have international folks come and visit to look at our rocks. So we've are a really great resource for data and information, not just for CCUS, but for a variety of projects. Another part that we're looking at is really mapping our geologic areas in more detail. So understanding our reservoirs in a lot more detail. Where are certain formations more likely or better for storage, and where are they not? And kind of what are some new areas that we haven't looked at before as well? And then the confining units. This is a heavily involved task for our students, where it's been integrated into the classroom and the geology department here at Western. So the part of the students and their classroom activities is that they're learning how to use all of these different analytical tools. So we've given them this problem of, we think that these rocks are potential confining units. Can you characterize them and tell us if you think that these are good for preventing CO2 leakage? So they get to test out a whole bunch of cool equipment. And at the end of the day, we get a lot of great data and information that comes out of this. And then we're working with Central Michigan University in a similar way, but they're looking at what's called geomechanical aspects. So it's how strong are the rocks, under what conditions would they break or bend, and any other type of considerations for this. And then what we'll do is integrate that all together to, again, make some maps to show kind of where is it good and where is it bad across the state. And then we're putting this into some tools. These are all under development right now, where we want people to be able to plug and play. They can put in their own data, or they can use all the data that we've collected in the back end, and they can go in and select, if you're interested maybe in Southwest Michigan, you can select an area and it will tell you what's the storage zone, what's a confining zone, is it a good confining zone, or are there some potential risks associated with it that we need to know about? And I mentioned the wellbore integrity. This is a huge undertaking. Another big place that the students are involved is developing this database, and we're working with records, publicly available records. So we want to understand things like, not just location, what is the well used for, how old is it, how deep is it, how it was constructed, if it was plugged, abandoned, how was that done, and is there enough information for us to determine if this is a done well enough or not. And then we have an early tool developed for this, and then soon we'll be collaborating with Eagle to review the tool and then develop some guidance for some different type of scenarios in the application. Here's an example of the tool. Again, it's very interactive, kind of click and play, where you can go into a certain area. It will tell you all about the wells. You can get a nice visual of saying, this is how deep a well is. This is maybe your water zone, your drinking water up here. So you have thousands of feet that separate it. Are there plugs that prevent leakage? Is there information? Are there issues reported for it? And then you get a score overall for whatever region or specific well that you select on kind of how good is it, or if it is it riskier or not riskier. It's just another county example. So I'll wrap up just telling you real quick about a couple other projects. So I mentioned that we recently were awarded this RITAP grant, which I'm really excited about because this is an opportunity to integrate all of these different pieces, integrate the history and current projects, and then kind of really develop this roadmap for CCUS in Michigan. But also with this, we have a lot of project partners. We have different universities. We have industry involvement. We have researchers involved. The National Tribal Energy Association is involved, and we have education specialists and outreach and engagement specialists as well. With this, we'll have a series of workshops. So targeting different audiences. We'll have some for like our regulators, some for students, some for industry. We'll have one for community leaders. So those start to inform communities about what is not just what is CCUS, but what are the resources available to you to help you make those decisions. And then we'll have a summer internships opening up as well for students. And then that Project Clean Michigan is direct air capture with our chemical engineering department. So where we fit in with that is a little bit different because they're developing that technology, but we're doing some additional tests on some of our rocks to make sure that we really understand the system in more detail. So this is really a synergistic or complementary work with some of the other projects. And that project hasn't started yet, but it will be soon. And we are recruiting graduate students to work on this project. So in summary, Michigan is a really exciting place right now for CCUS because we have a variety of sources. There's a variety of synergistic opportunities. We have a history of doing CCUS research and a lot of new projects starting to help us understand the storage options and to de-risk CCUS in general. And we have actually a really great relationship going with industry and various communities and other educators so that we can develop different types of materials and outreach materials. And that there's a lot of interest, I think, in seeing CCUS grow as a landscape. So there's new legislation in place and other legislation that's being developed to support CCUS across the state. I also want to leave it here with there's a lot of ways to stay updated and engaged. We have a quarterly newsletter. We are active on various social media platforms. And we have a YouTube channel too, and we have over 50 videos right now on YouTube, various topics from geotourism across the state to understanding the geology in Michigan. We have influential women in geoscience from Michigan and things like that. And we have a new video coming soon that is an introduction to CCUS, and then that will turn into a series where we'll add some additional content to that as well. So with that, I will stop and open it up for any questions.
Crystal, you have a question.
Hello. Yeah.
Or
or it might just be a comment, but yeah. Your project on the community engagement, just this 40 around the community benefits plan stuff is very interesting. And I have not all of those projects, but you have a lot going on is what I'm trying to say. But on that part specifically, I have a similar project, but in the hydrogen space. So it would be interesting to touch base with you on that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because one of the things that we've done earlier this year is that we started to develop an advisory board so that we get a broad, I think, set of voices and perspectives on our community benefits and engagement plans. So we did an early round of reviews with that advisory board. We just summarized all of that and put that together in a milestone report. But then we're going to continue engagement and build out that advisory board. So I will, if there's anybody interested from, from this group or other groups that want to be a part of that review board, absolutely open to having more folks involved.
Oh, Marianne?
I just wanted to say, Autumn, that I have heard that the people who say, well, we need to invest in carbon capture are thinking unrealistically, that there's no way that we can do this economically. And you've helped me to see that maybe that's too pessimistic. So thank you.
There's a lot of incentives out there too, that I think the biggest bottleneck or challenge economically is the capture technology. It can just be really expensive, and I understand why people are pessimistic about it working economically. But I think that we're at least from my experiences, I'm seeing a lot of companies that are saying, okay, that's just a commitment that we have to make on doing better and making a difference. So there are a lot of industries, companies out there that I think are making that commitment regardless of the economics, which is really exciting to see. But there are tax credits right now that are being used to help offset some of those costs, and that the value of those tax credits are dependent on the type of storage and the type of technology. So for example, for a saline storage option, people can claim up to $85 a ton of CO2 stored to help offset their costs. There's a lower amount for if you're using it for enhanced oil recovery. There's a greater amount if you're using direct air capture, just because that technology is still being developed. So that is, I think, a big driver for folks right now to help support their projects.
Thank you.
Well, I also think that carbon fees would help to push the carbon capture. And that's another advantage to having a carbon fee law passed, is rather than paying them $85 for have them pay for what they're doing. They're the ones that are polluting. Why are we giving them tax credits?
Well, and similar to that, there's discussions on having carbon fees associated with the storage, a smaller fee, but because the big question is, so what about long-term liability? How do you make sure that these projects are safe 100 years from now when if a company were to walk away from it? So having some fees established early on helps have a pool of money that's dedicated to any mitigation that might be needed in the future. So I know that that's a big discussion topic, in not just in Michigan, but in other states too.
I had a whole series of questions, actually. How much energy is used to turn CO2 gas into CO2 liquid so it can be transported and stored?
Yeah, I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but that's an excellent question. And that is largely driven by the volume and the type of technology is being used, and how pure your CO2 source is from the beginning. So the technology becomes more expensive the less pure your source of CO2 is, because there's a lot more separation that needs to happen. But we're working with University of Michigan on that new RIDEHAP grant, and that's one of the questions that they'll be seeking to answer. They'll be doing a life cycle analysis, so they'll see how much energy is needed to not just capture, but to process, to transport, to store it. How much CO2 is being produced in those methods, and then how much is actually being stored at the end. Because what we want to make sure is at the end of the day is that we are storing more than what we're producing. And so that's going to be part of their studies.
Okay, now transportation, is that via truck or pipeline or a combination?
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the projects. There's pipelines, there's trucks, trains, even they're talking about like barges of some sort, depending on where it's going. The most I think cost effective and less energy intensive uses through pipelines, which has its own type of considerations as well, considering the history of pipelines, not just in Michigan, but again, all through the US. So that becomes a serious conversation. Again, importance of engaging with communities is understanding the potential risks and impacts of that, and making sure that is being done safely.
Because once it's a liquid, does it have to stay pressurized to continue being a liquid, or because, so if a pipeline breaks, has a puncture or whatever,
Yep.
We would just be releasing all that gas again, or would we be releasing liquid? It
would release as a gas. That would depressurize very quickly. There's a CO2 pipeline in Mississippi that had but there was some sort of natural disaster that had caused that pipeline to fail. And so that was a real, I think, learning case study on what would happen and what that would look like and what that cleanup strategy is. It was really interesting, the pictures, because when CO2 is as a liquid, it's very cold. So it frosted all the nearby vegetation near that pipeline. But the CO2 when it's a gas is very dense and heavy, so it stays low to the ground. So it will migrate to low areas. So in that particular case study, there was a community that was in a valley that was close by, so that CO2 migrated down into the valley, and they did have to evacuate that community. But it brought a lot of, I think, a light to what type of preparations are needed, what type of training is needed for healthcare professionals, and what we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen in the future. I think that was about 4-ish years ago now, for that incident. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of, I think, good changes and regulations come out from after that.
Okay, so you can't just pump the liquid into a barge. It has to be under pressure somehow.
Yeah, that allows you. So if you think of like all the air in your room right now, that's a large volume, but if you compress it, you can put that down to a very small amount. And that's really the big driver for compressing it, so that you don't take up as much space, and you can be a lot more effective with your space.
No, I understand that. I'm just wondering how you can continue having that pressure on things that are like a truck. I mean, a liquid truck, or a carrying truck. It doesn't normally have that kind of pressure, so that it doesn't just explode and become shrapnel on the highway. And so I guess I'm concerned about that aspect of it, because of the amount of pressure that would be needed to keep it as a liquid. That any form of transportation could end up being relatively dangerous. You mentioned also
just a comment on that. There are trucks that transport pressurized gases and liquids currently on the road every day. I know from at least the hydrogen experience, they pressurize and transport liquid hydrogen. Now that's usually concentrated in some areas, like hydrogen's needed for space travel, so they've done it around like in Florida, where the space where they launch rockets and stuff. But yeah, so they do transport gases and liquid chemicals on trucks,
Yeah.
pressurized already.
Yeah, it's being done for CO2 food grade, CO2 that's being used to make our pops and other carbonated, beverages. So there are, already mechanisms, like you said, Crystal, in place that are doing this already.
Yeah, but aren't they usually
routes,
fairly
right?
close to where they're being used so that there's not a whole, it's not long distance travel if the factory is close to the place that it's being used. So that's part of, also the transportation is the distance. I lived in Colorado. We have some very narrow canyons with one road. And so we've always been, that's always been a concern is what happens if there's an accident, like I-70 got closed for a week because a boulder fell.
Wow. Yeah.
If a boulder falls on a pressurized train, which could happen on the track side of the highway, the canyon, then or if it falls on a CO2 truck or any other dangerous. We were concerned with when they wanted to ship nuclear waste through the
Yes.
canyon and it was like, wait a minute, this is a very narrow canyon. So there are ways around it, so that's a lot of my questions are because of my experiences in Colorado.
No,
Okay.
those are great questions. And one thing to note too is that it's far less hazardous, material than things like nuclear waste or
Right.
other types of hazardous waste that is already being transported. Is that you don't want to breathe it in high concentrations, of course. But in general, it does dissipate pretty rapidly. And the harm is fairly minimal.
Okay. You were talking about that one of the things that you can do is you can use CO2 to get out oil as sort of we used millions of gallons of water to do it in Colorado. So it sounds like that's what you're talking about. And my reaction is, do I really want that? I'm trying to get rid of oil. So my question is, how much money is being spent by the fossil fuel industry to support the work that you're doing?
That is a very common question. Folks are concerned that CCUS is primarily used to prolong oil and gas. And it is definitely being used by industry to help them recover oil, stranded oil. But it's not the only industry that benefits from CCUS. And often it's the only technology right now that some industries can use to capture their CO2. So I understand people's concerns about that because there's definitely a link to oil and gas, but there are so many other types of industries as well that are using CO2 and benefits from CO2.
Well, I wasn't questioning those other industries. My question is, how much money is being given to this kind of research by oil and gas so that keeps the oil and gas industry open?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I know that fluxes with administration. Right now, there isn't the federal, funding support. That's where a lot of my money and grants come from, is from the federal side of things. That is focused on the saline storage and a little bit in the basalts and a lot of these other types of technology development too. Past administration did put more focus on using, CO2 for oil and gas. So right now, there's not a lot of funding in it, but that could flex with administration changes too.
Okay, and when out west, when we use the water to move the oil, the water becomes extremely contaminated with radioactive plus everything else, benzene, all sorts of different chemicals that are extremely dangerous. And then that water is put into the injection wells. So if you use CO2 to force out what you're calling enhanced oil, does the CO2 come back out of that well and have to go into an injection well like the water does?
It's recycled. So what they
Okay.
do, so when they produce it up with the oil, it's a combination of CO2 and hydrocarbons, and they separate out the hydrocarbons, they separate that CO2, and then they'll use it again. So some of that CO2 gets left behind in that, say, the first cycle, some gets left behind, some gets reproduced. They separate it back out and they do it again. And they do it again until, if they think they're done or not, and then they store the remaining CO2 that's left at the end of that cycle.
Into an injection well.
Yeah, into the same wells that they're already using. Yeah, into the
Okay. And
geological.
the water injection wells are known to cause earthquakes.
Yes,
Will the
serious
CO
problem in Oklahoma. Yeah,
right.
and the Permian Basin too. We're part of what we're doing in our upcoming studies is that we're taking a closer look at our faults and fractures throughout Michigan to understand how they're oriented and what kind of stresses could potentially reactivate them. And that's really important to making sure that we're not going to induce any seismicity. And then we're also going to develop a strategy to monitor for that. So what type of technologies is needed? When do we say stop, hold, caution, or when do we stop completely? So we're putting a lot of thought into that and developing that plan under our RITAP grant.
Yeah, because to monitor it, the damage is already done. As soon as
one thing that's really great with Michigan is that we are very structurally stable. We've had a couple of earthquakes, but they're not common. And there's been no documented cases of induced seismicity, and there's been a long history of injection in Michigan, not just oil and gas, but there's a lot of waste disposal, there's brine disposal. So with all these various injection activities, there have not been anything that's been recorded as being caused or induced earthquakes. So we can learn from that, but you also there's a whole lot of other work that we do to make sure. So we build out a bunch of different models to 3D model of the subsurface, what that looks like. And then we run through different simulations on if we're injecting this much, this fast, what happens, or how fast until something bad happens. And then we use that as our initial threshold and we back it out from there because we never want to even get close to that threshold, but we use that as a guide to develop our strategies for monitoring or for these operations and for long-term monitoring.
The 90,000 well bores, that also concerns me, using an existing well bore when you really don't know the condition of the casing after the years in the ground. The casing could be cracked, whatever, and you don't really know that condition. So
yeah, so that's why in this database that we're building, we put all the information on what type of casing it is, what type of cement was used to secure that casing, where was it set, if it's no longer an active well, if it was plugged, or did they remove some of that casing? So we're trying to put a full picture together on what do we know and what's the potential risk with those wells. I guess the good news for this is that the older the well is, the shallower it is. So most of the old wells aren't going to penetrate because they just didn't really, they didn't get down that far. So you see that real correlation with it, but there are deep wells that we don't have a lot of information on. Eagle has a program, the Orphan Well program right now, which is locating these wells and plugging them up and making sure that they're not going to be pathways, not specifically for CCUS, but it is a really great program that's helping us be aware of potential other wells that we don't know about. And then with any due diligence for a site, that should be one of the first things that you do is you're looking usually with some sort of seismic data, looking for, are there wells there you don't know about? Is there any faults or structure things that you didn't know about before you move forward with other types of characterization? And then if there are existing wells, is really understanding, you know, how, like I said, how old are they? What type of materials are there? What is your monitoring strategy, so that they would have some type of equipment nearby to see if there is any leaks or even a history of leaks at that area.
Can you store in existing mines? Because don't we have a number of mines also in northern?
We do have a number of mines. I would not encourage that as a possibility because of the type of escape routes are much larger and more unknown. And how unless you do some, I just don't, I truly don't see that as a
Okay,
safe.
what about if you turn it into the rock like you were talking about, where you turn the carbon into basalt? Wouldn't that need storage somewhere? I mean,
It still has to happen in the
or do you-
subsurface. Yeah, so you'd
Oh,
still have an
okay.
injection well to do that. But
Okay.
there wouldn't be the same type of leakage risks once it has, you know, turned into a solid.
Where do we stand in actually being able to capture the carbon that is being generated by these different industries? If it's coming out of a smokestack, maybe, but what about other stuff? I mean, and are we there? Can we capture?
We're there. I mean, it depends on the industry. Things like ethanol plants, the technology is there. They're already capturing that CO2 but it's a really pure source of CO2. So the technology is the cheapest. There are others that are still under development, but there are several projects that are already up and running. Some good examples are the projects in Illinois and Indiana. Where they are already capturing and storing CO2 from various types of sources. And we're seeing those types of projects pop up more and more, especially with this carbon safe program through DOE.
Okay, so by doing carbon capture, utilization, and storage, are we encouraging or not discouraging, however you want to look at it, the creation of carbon dioxide? So instead of becoming a green cement, is it okay to continue doing cement the way it's being done and just producing more and more carbon dioxide?
Yeah, I see your question. I view this as a transitional technology, right? It gives us the time that we need to start making a change now while we're working on making our current processes more efficient or coming up with new technology where we don't produce as much CO2. So, you know, ideally from, you know, this is my personal opinion here, is that I would like to see this not be the long-term solution, but our short-term solution until we can get to a better place as a society and till our technology catches up some more. You know, if, like I said, if there's other questions that come up, or if folks are watching the video later that have questions, I'm happy share my email, or we can set up a separate kind of Q&A type of call too.
I thank you for your presentation. It